Sometimes the most important moment of your life comes when you least expect it. For Tormund, a humble fisherman with nothing but a patched boat and weathered hands, that moment arrived in the middle of a deadly storm. When a noble ship crashed against the fjord's rocks, Tormund didn't think twice. He dove into the churning waters and pulled out Ingrid, daughter of the most powerful jarl in the land. He saved her life and expected nothing in return. But Ingrid had other plans. She chose the poor fisherman over wealthy suitors, shocking everyone in their village. Their love story didn't just change two hearts. It changed how an entire people saw honor, worth, and what truly matters in life. But what happens when a love born from courage faces the harsh world of Viking politics? Before we dive deeper into this tale, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story stirs something in you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like an old woman's shawl, soft and grey against the granite cliffs that had watched over these waters for countless generations. Tormund Eriksson stood at the edge of his weathered dock, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of pine needle tea, breathing in the familiar scent of salt and seaweed that had marked every dawn of his 32 years. His boat, the Sea Mother, bobbed gently in the protected cove that served as Saltvik's modest harbour. She wasn't much to look at. Her hull bore the scars of 1,000 storms, her sail patched with fabric from worn-out fishing nets, and her rigging held together more by hope and stubbornness than by proper rope. But she was his, earned through years of backbreaking work and careful saving, and she had never failed to bring him home. Tormund's cottage sat apart from the main village, perched on a rocky outcrop that jutted into the fjord like a gnarled finger pointing toward the open sea. It was a humble dwelling, built by his grandfather's hands from driftwood and stones gathered from the shore. The roof leaked when the rains came hard, and the walls groaned when winter winds howled down from the mountains. But it was the only home he had ever known. The village of Saltvik spread along the shoreline below him, a collection of timber houses and workshops clustered around the harbour like chicks seeking shelter under their mother's wing. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying the scents of breakfast fires and the day's first bread. Children's voices drifted up from the lanes between houses, mixed with the sound of axes splitting wood and the rhythmic hammering from Olaf's smithy. These were his people. Fishermen and farmers, craftsmen and traders who worked with their hands and knew the value of honest labor. They were not wealthy, but they were free, bound together by blood, marriage, and the shared struggles that came with wresting a living from the harsh northern lands. Tormund had grown up among them, learned their trades, shared their sorrows and celebrations. He was one of them, yet always somehow apart. His father, Eric the net mender, had been the finest fisherman in 3 villages, able to read the moods of the sea like other men read runes carved in stone. But Eric had died when Tormund was barely 16, his boat found empty and drifting after a sudden squall. His mother, Astrid, had followed her husband to the grave within the year, her heart simply too broken to keep beating. Since then, Tormund had lived alone, fishing the same waters his father had taught him, mending the same nets with techniques passed down through generations of seafolk. He was respected for his skill and his integrity, trusted to keep his word and help his neighbors when the need arose. But he was also pitied, in the gentle way that people pity those who seem destined to remain alone. The unmarried women of the village had long since given up their subtle hints and sidelong glances. At 32, Tormund was considered set in his solitary ways, too poor to offer much of a bride price, and too proud to accept the charity that might have made him more appealing. He had made his peace with that reality, or so he told himself, as he watched younger men court and marry and start families of their own. 3 miles across the fjord's dark waters, the fortress of Ravnsholm rose from its island like a crown of stone and timber. Even at this distance, Tormund could make out the banners flying from its towers, the black raven on golden field that marked the seat of Jarl Hakon Ironhand, the most powerful lord in the northern reaches. Hakon ruled his lands with the iron fist his name suggested, but he was known to be fair in his judgments and generous to those who served him well. His warriors were the finest in the region, his longships swift and strong, his halls filled with the treasures won through trade and conquest. Tormund had seen those halls once, years ago, when his father had been summoned to present the village's tribute of fish and furs. He remembered the overwhelming richness of it all, the tapestries depicting great battles, the silver cups and golden arm rings, the weapons forged by master smiths and inlaid with precious metals. But most of all, he remembered the people who moved through those halls like exotic birds, dressed in fine wool dyed in colors he couldn't name, speaking in soft voices about matters far removed from the daily struggle of nets and weather. Among them had been a girl, perhaps 12 years old, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of winter sky. She had watched the tribute ceremony with curious intelligence, asking her father quiet questions about the fish and the men who caught them. When Jarl Hakon had spoken briefly to Eric about the fishing conditions, the girl had listened intently, as if memorizing every word. That had been Ingrid, Hakon's only child and heir, though Tormund hadn't learned her name until years later. The memory of her had faded with time, becoming just another fragment of that overwhelming day when a fisherman's son had glimpsed the world of lords and ladies. Now, 20 years later, he stood on his dock and watched the early morning light catch the towers of Ravnsholm, turning the grey stone to gold. Somewhere in those towers, the Jarl's daughter had grown into a woman, probably married by now to some powerful ally. Her children destined to inherit lands and titles that men like Tormund could scarcely imagine. The thought brought no bitterness, only the familiar acceptance that had marked most of his adult years. The world was as it was, with its layers and divisions, as fixed as the stones of the mountains. Fishermen caught fish, jarls made laws, and the distance between them remained as vast as the fjord itself. Tormund finished his tea and set the cup aside, his practiced eye already reading the signs of wind and weather. The mist was lifting, revealing patches of blue sky that promised a fair day for fishing. The wind came from the northwest, steady but not strong, perfect for his small boat's patched sail. He had nets to check and lines to set. The herring were running thick in the deeper waters beyond the headland, and if his luck held, he might fill his hold before noon. It would be enough to keep him fed for another week, with perhaps a few extra fish to trade for flour and ale, as he prepared to cast off. Tormund allowed himself a moment to appreciate the simple beauty of the morning. The sun painted golden paths across the water, seabirds wheeled and cried overhead, and the mountains stood like ancient guardians against the brightening sky. Whatever sorrows and struggles the day might bring, this moment was perfect in its quiet peace. He had no way of knowing that before the sun set again, his ordered world would be shattered by storm and rescue, that the girl from his distant memory would return to his life as a woman grown, or that the simple act of pulling a stranger from the waves would set in motion events that would transform not just his own fate, but the destiny of everyone he knew. For now there was only the morning, the sea, and the honest work of a fisherman setting out to meet whatever the day might bring. Tormund Eriksson pushed his boat into the gentle swells and raised his patched sail to catch the wind, following the path his father had taught him toward the deeper waters where the fish ran thick and the future waited. Unknown and unknowable, beneath the waves, the storm came from nowhere, as northern storms often do, transforming a peaceful afternoon into a nightmare of wind and fury. Tormund had been checking his nets in the deeper waters beyond Seal Point when the sky darkened with unnatural speed. Black clouds boiling up from the horizon like smoke from some vast fire. He felt the change in his bones before he saw it, that peculiar pressure in the air that every experienced sailor learns to recognize. The sea beneath his boat shifted from gentle swells to choppy confusion, and the wind that had been his ally all morning suddenly turned savage and unpredictable. "You see now." "See, mother," he murmured to his boat, hauling in his nets with practiced efficiency. The catch had been good. His hold already held enough fish to justify the day's work, but none of that would matter if he couldn't make it back to harbour before the storm hit in earnest. The first drops of rain struck his face like cold needles, and within moments the gentle shower had become a driving deluge that turned the world grey and formless. Tormund pulled his oiled cloak tight around his shoulders and squinted through the sheets of water, trying to keep his bearings in the rapidly deteriorating visibility. That's when he heard it, a sound that cut through the howling wind like a blade through flesh. The deep, resonant crack of timber under impossible stress, followed by human screams carried on the gale. Through the rain and spray, he caught a glimpse of movement on the water. A ship, much larger than his own humble craft, was fighting for its life against the rocks that guarded the entrance to Hawke's Bay. Even as he watched, another wave lifted the vessel and slammed it down with crushing force. And he heard that terrible sound again, the death cry of a well-built ship meeting its end. Tormund didn't hesitate. His father had taught him that the sea recognized only one law, that those who could help must help, regardless of the risk. He turned the sea mother toward the sound of disaster, fighting wind and current with every skill he possessed. As he drew closer, the scene became clear in terrible detail. The ship was one of Jarl Hakon's vessels, judging by its size and the quality of its construction. It must have been caught in the same sudden storm while returning to Ravensholm, driven off course by winds too strong for even experienced sailors to master. The ship's hull had been split open like a broken egg, and already the hungry waves were claiming their prize. Men struggled in the churning water, some clinging to pieces of wreckage, others trying desperately to swim toward shore through seas that seemed determined to drag them down. Tormund's small boat danced like a leaf on the massive swells, but he knew these waters better than any man alive. Threading between the jagged rocks with a precision born of lifelong experience, he began pulling survivors from the water, hauling them aboard with strength that came from years of wrestling nets and sails. First came a young warrior, barely conscious, but still gripping his sword. Then an older man, a craftsman by his clothes, who gasped out thanks in a voice hoarse with seawater. One by one, Tormund filled his small boat with the shipwrecked, pushing the sea mother beyond her limits as the storm raged around them. It was on his fourth trip into the debris field that he saw her. She floated face down near a piece of painted decking, her fine woolen cloak spread around her like the wings of some great seabird. Her golden hair moved with the current like strands of kelp, and for a moment Tormund thought he was looking at a corpse. But as he maneuvered closer, she stirred, lifting her head just enough to gasp for air before the waves tried to claim her again. Without thinking, Tormund dove over the side of his boat, the shock of the cold water driving the breath from his lungs. The storm-tossed sea tried to separate them, but he fought through the churning foam and got his arms around her. Just as she began to sink, she was heavier than he expected. The woolen cloak had absorbed water like a sponge, but he managed to drag her to the sea mother's side. Getting her aboard was a struggle that nearly cost them both their lives, but finally she lay gasping on the deck, seawater streaming from her mouth and nose, even soaked and half-drowned. There was something about her that spoke of nobility. Her cloak was woven from the finest wool and dyed a deep blue that only the wealthy could afford. Her hands, though scratched by the wreckage, were soft and uncalloused. Most telling of all, she wore a silver arm ring, inscribed with runes that Tormund couldn't read but recognized as the mark of high birth. As she coughed up seawater and slowly returned to consciousness, Tormund caught a glimpse of her face, even battered by the storm and pale with cold. Her features held a familiar beauty that stirred something deep in his memory. Those eyes, that particular shade of winter blue, the Jarl's daughter, he breathed, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. This was Ingrid Hakon's daughter, the girl from his childhood memory grown into a woman, the heir to Ravensholm, daughter of the most powerful man in the northern lands. lay shivering in the bottom of a poor fisherman's boat, while the storm that had nearly killed her continued to rage overhead. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper lost in the wind. Tormund wrapped his own cloak around her, adding its warmth to what little her waterlogged garments could provide. Her skin was deadly pale, her lips blue with cold, and he could feel the tremors that shook her slender frame. The storm was growing worse, not better. Other survivors still struggled in the water, but Tormund faced a terrible choice. He could try to save more lives and risk losing all of them, including the jarl's daughter, or he could make for shore with those he had already rescued. The decision was made for him when a massive wave, larger than any that had come before, lifted the remains of the noble ship and flung it against the rocks with finality. The grinding crash echoed across the water like thunder, and when the foam cleared, nothing remained but scattered debris and the few survivors already in his boat. Tormund turned the Sea Mother toward home, fighting every yard against wind and current that seemed determined to drive them back onto the rocks. His passengers huddled together for warmth, too exhausted to do more than hold on as the small boat plunged through waves that towered over her mast. The storm began to break just as the familiar outline of Saltvik's harbour appeared through the driving rain. Word of the shipwreck had somehow reached shore ahead of them, and half the village waited on the docks despite the weather. Willing hands reached out to help the survivors ashore. Voices called out questions and offers of aid. And someone ran to fetch the village healer. As Tormund lifted the unconscious form of Ingrid from his boat, he felt the weight of more than just her body. This rescue would change everything. He could feel it in his bones like another storm approaching. The simple life he had known was ending, replaced by something he couldn't yet understand, but already feared. Jarl Hakon's daughter owed her life to a poor fisherman. In the rigid hierarchy of their world that created bonds and obligations that could reshape the fate of everyone involved. As he carried her toward the warmth and shelter of the village, Tormund wondered if saving her had been an act of courage or the most dangerous thing he had ever done. The cottage had never felt so small. What once had been Tormund's sanctuary now seemed cramped and inadequate, with Ingrid lying pale and still on his simple bed. The village healer, old Ragnar, bustled about with her herbs and warm cloths, muttering under her breath about salt-water sickness and the folly of sailing in such weather. "She needs warmth and rest," Ragnar declared, wrapping another woolen blanket around Ingrid's shivering form. The cold nearly took her. Another few minutes in that water. She left the thought unfinished, but her meaning was clear. Tormund stood awkwardly by the small fire, unsure what to do with his hands. The other survivors had been distributed among various households in the village. Their wounds tended and their needs met, with the automatic hospitality of sea folk who understood the capricious nature of storms. But Ingrid's presence in his home felt different, charged with implications that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Should we not send word to her father?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Ragnar shot him a sharp look. "In this storm? No bird could fly, no boat could cross the fjord. We'll send word when the weather clears, but for now she's our responsibility." The old woman's voice carried a note of satisfaction that puzzled Tormund until he remembered her long-standing complaints about the jarl's taxes on healing herbs through the shuttered window. The storm continued its assault on the village. Wind howled around the cottage's corners, driving rain against the walls with the persistence of an enemy siege. The very air seemed to vibrate with the storm's fury, making conversation difficult and sleep impossible. Tormund settled himself on a bench near the door, wrapped in his spare cloak. Every few minutes he found his gaze drawn to the figure on the bed, the rise and fall of her breathing. The way the firelight caught the golden strands of her hair, the delicate curve of her hand resting atop the blankets. She was beautiful, he admitted to himself, but it was a beauty that belonged to a different world. Even in her current state, everything about her spoke of privilege and refinement. Her skin, despite its current pallor, had the softness that came from a life sheltered from harsh weather and manual labor. Her hair, even matted with seawater, held the lustrous quality that only came from the finest care. As the night wore on, Ingrid began to stir. Her breathing became less shallow, and colour slowly returned to her cheeks. Near dawn, her eyes fluttered open, revealing that startling blue that Tormund remembered from their childhood encounter. For a moment, she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling with confusion. Then her gaze found Tormund sitting in the shadows, and he saw recognition dawn in her expression, not of him specifically, but of her situation. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, but carried the cultured tones of the educated nobility. "Safe," Tormund replied simply. "In Saltvik village. You were shipwrecked." She struggled to sit up, wincing at the effort. "The others, my escort, the crew, some were saved. Others," he spread his hands helplessly. "The sea keeps what it claims." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back with a control that spoke of years of training in royal composure. "You pulled me from the water." It wasn't a question, but Tormund nodded anyway. "You were unconscious, nearly drowned. I remember the water closing over my head. The cold," she shuddered. "Then nothing until now." Ragnar had been dozing by the fire, but the sound of voices roused her. She approached the bed with professional briskness, checking Ingrid's pulse and the colour of her eyes with the practiced efficiency of one who had dealt with countless emergencies. "You're fortunate," she announced. "Another hour in that water would have finished you. Your rescuer here has quick hands and a brave heart." Ingrid's gaze returned to Tormund, studying him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "I know you," she said finally. "Don't I?" Tormund's heart skipped. "I don't think so, my lady." Our paths wouldn't have crossed, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. There was a thoughtfulness in her eyes, as if she were reaching for a memory just beyond her grasp. The storm began to break as morning advanced, the wind's fury gradually subsiding to a more manageable bluster. Through the gaps in the clouds, shafts of sunlight painted golden patches on the cottage walls, and the sound of voices from the village suggested that people were beginning to venture outside. A knock at the door interrupted the quiet of the sick room. Tormund opened it to find Bjorn the smith, his weathered face creased with concern. "How is she?" Bjorn asked without preamble. "Recovering," Tormund replied. "Ragnar says she'll mend." Bjorn nodded gravely. "Good, because there's been talk in the village. Some think we should have sent word to Ravnsholm immediately, storm or no storm. Others worry about what the jarl might think when he learns his daughter spent the night in a bachelor's cottage. These implications hit Tormund like a cold wave. In their society, a young woman's honor was as fragile as spun glass, and even the most innocent circumstances could be twisted into scandal. The fact that Ingrid had spent the night under his roof, regardless of the necessity that had driven the arrangement, could be interpreted as a serious breach of propriety. "What do you suggest?" Tormund asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Marry her," Bjorn said bluntly. "It's the only way to protect both your reputations." Tormund stared at his neighbor in shock. "She's the jarl's daughter. I'm nobody. He'd never consent to such a match. Maybe not. She owes you her life. That creates obligations. And if word spreads about last night..." Bjorn shrugged expressively. From inside the cottage came the sound of Ingrid's voice, speaking quietly with Ragnar. Tormund found himself listening to the musical quality of her speech. "So different from the rough accents of the village folk. This is madness," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt a strange stirring in his chest. Not quite hope, but something dangerously close to it. "Think about it," Bjorn advised. "The storm may have brought you more than just another rescue. Sometimes the gods arrange things in ways we don't expect." As his neighbor departed, Tormund stood in his doorway, looking out at the storm-battered village. Debris from the previous night's fury littered the streets, and the harbor showed the scars of waves that had overtopped the breakwater. But the sun was shining now, and people were already beginning the work of cleaning up and rebuilding. Behind him, in his simple cottage, lay a woman whose very presence had already changed everything he thought he knew about his life. The careful boundaries of his world. Fisherman here, Nobility there had been shattered as thoroughly as the ship that had brought her to his shore. Whatever came next, Tormund realized, would require more courage than diving into a storm-tossed sea. By midday, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling under pale sunlight. The fjord, which hours before had been a cauldron of fury, now lay calm as green glass, reflecting the scattered clouds that drifted across the clearing sky. Ingrid had insisted on rising despite Ragnar's protests, and now sat by the window, wrapped in one of Tormund's spare cloaks. The simple garment, rough-woven and practical, seemed to diminish her somehow, making her appear younger and more vulnerable than her station suggested. "The water looks so peaceful now," she observed, watching fishing boats emerge from their shelters to assess the storm's damage. "It's hard to believe it nearly killed us all just hours ago." Tormund stood near the door, still maintaining the respectful distance he felt appropriate between a fisherman and a jarl's daughter. "The sea has many moods," he said. "My father used to say it was like a woman, beautiful and terrible by turns, and never quite predictable." She turned to look at him, and he caught something in her expression, amusement perhaps, or mild reproach. "And what do you think of that comparison?" Heat rose in Tormund's cheeks as he realized how his words might sound to a woman's ears. I meant no offense." "It was just something he used to say. I'm not offended," she replied, with a slight smile. "Though I might point out that the sea, at least, doesn't have to worry about men making decisions about its future without consulting it first." The comment was delivered lightly, but Tormund caught the underlying edge. Here was a reminder, subtle but clear, that for all her apparent helplessness, Ingrid was no ordinary woman. She was heir to one of the most powerful holdings in the northern lands, educated in statecraft and politics, accustomed to having her voice heard in matters that affected her life. A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Voices carried across the village, urgent and excited, and Tormund stepped outside to investigate. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 longboats were crossing the fjord under full sail, their dragon prows cutting through the calm water with predatory grace. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the black raven banners that flew from their masts. Jarl Hakon had come for his daughter. "They're here," Tormund said simply as he returned to the cottage. Ingrid nodded, her face composed, but her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her borrowed cloak. "My father doesn't wait for invitations when someone he loves is in danger." The village erupted into activity as the longboats approached. Children ran alongside the shore, shouting excitedly at the sight of the great ships. Women hurried to put on their finest clothes, while men checked their appearance and practiced the proper words of greeting for a jarl's unexpected visit. Within the cottage, an awkward silence settled over its 3 occupants. Ragnar busied herself with tidying up her healing supplies, while Tormund and Ingrid sat on opposite sides of the small room, like actors who had forgotten their lines. "I should thank you properly," Ingrid said finally, "before they arrive. Once my father gets here, there will be ceremonies and formal speeches, but I wanted you to know." She paused, searching for words. "What you did yesterday required more than just courage. You risked everything to save strangers. That kind of selflessness is rare, regardless of birth or station." Tormund found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her voice, despite her recent ordeal. This was not the pampered noble daughter he had expected, but a woman of substance and character. "Anyone would have done the same," he said. "No," she replied firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most men would have considered the risk too great, the reward too small." "You didn't hesitate." Before Tormund could respond, the sound of boots on his threshold announced the arrival of visitors. The cottage door swung open without ceremony, and suddenly the small space was filled with armed warriors wearing the finest mail and carrying weapons that gleamed like silver. Behind them came Jarl Hakon himself. Tormund had seen the Jarl from a distance many times, but face to face, the man's presence was overwhelming. Tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and eyes like winter storms, Hakon commanded attention simply by existing. His clothes were rich but practical, fine wool and leather, with silver fittings on his sword belt and a gold arm ring that caught the firelight. "Daughter," he said, and despite the single word's simplicity, it carried depths of relief and love that made Tormund's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Ingrid rose gracefully and moved to embrace her father, who wrapped his arms around her as if she were still a small child. For a moment, the fearsome jarl was simply a father who had nearly lost his daughter, and Tormund found himself looking away from the intimacy of their reunion. "I thought," Hakon began, then stopped, composing himself. When he spoke again, his voice carried its usual authority. "The storm was fierce. When your ship didn't return, we feared the worst." "It was the worst for many," Ingrid replied sadly. "Captain Ragnar, young Olsen, half the crew, the sea claimed them all. If not for this man's courage, I would have joined them." Hakon's gaze turned to Tormund, who suddenly felt like a mouse that had attracted the attention of a hawk. The jarl's eyes took in everything: the humble cottage, Tormund's simple clothes, the calloused hands that marked him as a laborer. "You are the fisherman who pulled my daughter from the waves." It wasn't a question, but Tormund nodded anyway. "Tormund Eriksson, my lord, son of Eric the net-mender." "I knew your father," Hakon said, surprising him. "A good man, honest in his dealings, skilled at his trade." The jarl stepped closer, and Tormund caught the scent of leather and steel that clung to him. "You have my gratitude, Tormund Eriksson. Name your reward." The words hung in the air like an unsheathed blade. Tormund felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the warriors watching with professional interest, Ragnar peering from her corner with obvious curiosity, and most of all, Ingrid's steady blue eyes that seemed to hold some message he couldn't decipher. "No reward is necessary, my lord," he said finally. "I did what any man would do." Hakon's eyebrows rose slightly. "Nevertheless, a debt exists. Such debts must be acknowledged and repaid, or the social order that binds us all begins to fray. Think carefully about what you might ask for. I am not a man who makes such offers lightly." As the jarl spoke, Tormund became aware of a subtle tension in the room, a sense that currents he couldn't see were flowing beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward conversation. Something in Ingrid's expression suggested that more was at stake here than simple gratitude, but he couldn't begin to guess what it might be. The feast that followed was unlike anything Saltvik had ever seen. Jarl Hakon, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including his own warriors, declared that the celebration of his daughter's rescue would take place in the village itself, rather than at Ravnsholm. Tables appeared as if by magic, carried from the longboats, along with barrels of ale, wheels of cheese, and joints of meat that made the villagers' eyes widen with wonder. Tormund found himself seated at the high table beside Ingrid, a position that felt as precarious as walking a ship's rigging in a storm. The rough wooden benches of the village hall had been draped with fine cloth, and silver cups replaced the usual horn drinking vessels. The transformation was so complete that he barely recognized his own community. "You're uncomfortable," Ingrid observed quietly, speaking under the cover of her father's loud conversation with the village elders. "I'm a fisherman sitting at a jarl's table," Tormund replied. "Uncomfortable doesn't begin to describe it." She smiled at that, a genuine expression that softened her features. "My father means well, but he sometimes forgets that not everyone appreciates grand gestures. He's trying to honor you, you know." "I know, and I'm grateful. It's just—" He gestured around the transformed hall. "This isn't my world." "Perhaps not," she said thoughtfully. "But you saved someone from my world, which creates certain obligations. Whether you like it or not, you're part of something larger now." Before Tormund could respond, Jarl Hakon rose to his feet, and the entire hall fell silent. The jarl raised his silver cup, and every eye in the room fixed on his face. "Friends and neighbors of Saltvik," he began, his voice carrying easily to the farthest corners of the hall. "Yesterday, your kinsman Tormund Eriksson performed an act of courage that has earned not just my gratitude, but my deepest respect. When lesser men might have sought shelter, he risked his life to save strangers from the storm's fury." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Tormund felt his face burning with embarrassment, but also with a pride he couldn't deny. Such courage deserves recognition, Hakon continued. Therefore I name Tormund Eriksson a friend of Ravnsholm, with all the rights and privileges that title carries. Let it be known throughout the northern lands that he and his descendants are welcome in my halls, and that any who offer them insult offer it to me as well. The hall erupted in cheers, but Tormund barely heard them. The title Hakon had bestowed was no empty honor. It carried real weight, real privileges. A friend of Ravnsholm could trade in the jarl's name, seek justice in his courts, even claim sanctuary in his fortress if need arose. It was a gift that could transform not just Tormund's life, but the lives of children he might one day have. Yet as the celebration swirled around him, Tormund found himself thinking not of the honor, but of the price it might exact. Nothing came without cost in this world, and gifts from powerful men often carried obligations that weren't immediately apparent. His unease deepened when he noticed a group of well-dressed men near the hall's entrance, newcomers who had arrived with the evening tide. Their clothes marked them as nobles, and their expressions suggested they weren't entirely pleased with the day's developments. One of them, a tall man with elaborately braided hair and enough gold jewelry to outfit a ship, caught Tormund's attention particularly. There was something predatory in the way he watched the proceedings, like a wolf studying a flock of sheep. "Who is that?" Tormund asked Ingrid, nodding toward the newcomer. Ingrid followed his gaze, and her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Magnus Ulfsson, the jarl's nephew and his most likely heir if... She stopped herself, but the implication was clear. If something happened to her, he doesn't look pleased with your father's generosity. Magnus believes strongly in the traditional order of things. Birth, bloodline, the proper distance between social ranks. Her voice carried a note of distaste. He's never approved of my father's more democratic impulses. As if summoned by their attention, Magnus began making his way toward the high table, his smile bright but somehow predatory. He moved with the fluid grace of a trained warrior, and Tormund noticed that his hand rested casually near his sword hilt. "Uncle," Magnus said as he reached them, his tone respectful but cool. A grand celebration. Though I confess surprise at the venue, Hakon's expression remained neutral, but Tormund caught the subtle tension that suddenly charged the air between the two men. The hero of the day comes from Saltvik. It seemed appropriate to honor him among his own people. "Of course," Magnus agreed, his gaze shifting to Tormund with obvious assessment. "Though I wonder if such elevation might create false expectations. A fisherman is still a fisherman regardless of his courage." The insult was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Tormund felt his anger rise, but before he could respond, Ingrid spoke. "How interesting that you should say so, cousin," she said, her voice carrying the dangerous sweetness of honey over a blade. "I wasn't aware that courage was determined by birth rather than action. Perhaps you could enlighten us about the heroic deeds that have established your own reputation." Magnus's smile faltered slightly, and Tormund saw his jaw tighten. "I merely meant to observe that social order serves important purposes. When that order is disrupted, even for the best of reasons, consequences follow." "What consequences?" Hakon asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Confusion about one's proper place. Presumption beyond one's station. The erosion of respect for traditional authority." Magnus's gaze returned to Tormund. "Surely you understand, uncle, that extraordinary circumstances don't necessarily justify extraordinary rewards." The hall had grown quieter, conversations dying as people sensed the tension at the high table. Tormund found himself at the center of what felt increasingly like a trial, with his very worthiness being debated by men whose casual words could shape his entire future. "I see," Hakon said slowly. "And what would you consider an appropriate response to the saving of my daughter's life?" Magnus spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable moderation. "A purse of silver, certainly. Perhaps a small holding, enough to ensure comfort, but not enough to inspire dangerous ambitions. Recognition appropriate to his station, not elevation beyond it. His station, Ingrid repeated, her voice sharp as winter ice. And who determines that, cousin? The gods? The accident of birth? Or simply the convenience of men who prefer the world arranged to their advantage? The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and Tormund saw several of the watching nobles exchange meaningful glances. This was more than a debate about his reward. It was a clash of philosophies about power, merit, and the proper ordering of society. Magnus's mask of reasonableness slipped slightly, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath. Some things are simply natural law, cousin. Fish swim in the sea, birds fly in the air, and fishermen catch fish. When we attempt to change the natural order, chaos follows. Then perhaps, Ingrid said, rising gracefully to her feet, it's time for some chaos. The morning after the feast brought unwelcome visitors to Tormund's cottage. He woke to find Magnus Ulfsson waiting outside his door with 2 armed companions, their presence as subtle as a storm cloud on a clear day. Fisherman, Magnus greeted him with cold civility. I thought we should speak privately, away from last night's festivities. Tormund stepped outside, closing the door behind him. He had no desire to bring whatever this was into the space where Ingrid had so recently recovered. What can I do for you, my lord? You can listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Magnus moved closer, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried more menace than shouting. My uncle is a generous man, perhaps too generous. His gratitude for my cousin's rescue has clouded his judgment regarding appropriate rewards. Your uncle seemed quite clear about his intentions. Did he? Magnus smiled, but it held no warmth. Tell me, fisherman, what do you know about the politics of the northern jarls? About the alliances that keep the peace, the marriages that bind families together, the careful balance of power that prevents these lands from descending into chaos? Tormund said nothing, sensing a trap in the question. I thought not, Magnus continued. You see, Ingrid is not simply a daughter. She's a political asset of tremendous value. Her marriage will determine who controls these lands after my uncle's death, who commands the loyalty of his warriors, who decides the fate of every fisherman and farmer from here to the northern seas. That's hardly my concern, isn't it? Magnus's eyes glittered dangerously. Last night, I watched my cousin look at you with something approaching interest, perhaps even admiration. Such feelings in a woman of her position can lead to unfortunate decisions. The implication hit Tormund like a physical blow. You're suggesting that she might... He couldn't finish the sentence. The very idea seeming too absurd and dangerous to voice. I'm suggesting that rescue can create powerful emotions, especially in impressionable young women. Gratitude can be mistaken for deeper feelings, and romantic notions about love, conquering all, can override practical considerations. Magnus stepped even closer. I'm also suggesting that a wise man would recognize such dangers and act to prevent them. One of Magnus's companions, a scarred warrior with cold eyes, shifted slightly, his hand moving to rest on his sword hilt. The gesture was casual but unmistakable. What exactly are you asking me to do? Disappear, Magnus said simply. Take your reward, your new title, and remove yourself from the situation. Travel south to the trading ports, perhaps. Use your enhanced status to build a new life far from here. Everyone benefits. You escape the dangerous complexities of court politics, and Ingrid avoids the scandal of an inappropriate attachment. And if I refuse? Magnus's smile widened. Why would you refuse? You're a simple fisherman who stumbled into circumstances beyond your understanding. Surely you can see the wisdom in accepting a graceful exit before those circumstances become complicated. The threat beneath the reasonable words was clear enough. But before Tormund could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. How thoughtful of you to visit. Cousin. Ingrid emerged from behind Olaf's smithy, where she had apparently been observing the conversation. She wore a simple dress borrowed from one of the village women, but her bearing remained unmistakably regal. The 2 warriors with Magnus stepped back instinctively, recognizing authority despite her modest attire. Ingrid, Magnus said, recovering quickly. I was just ensuring our hero understands the full implications of his newfound status. I'm sure you were. She moved to stand beside Tormund, a positioning that felt both protective and defiant. Though I wonder why such explanations require armed escorts, merely a precaution. The roads can be dangerous, especially for someone of my position traveling with valuable cargo. Magnus gestured toward a cart loaded with chests that Tormund hadn't noticed before. Speaking of which, I bring a more substantial token of my uncle's gratitude. He signaled to one of his men, who opened the nearest chest to reveal a fortune in silver coins, enough to buy a dozen boats like the Sea Mother. The wealth gleamed in the morning sunlight, more money than Tormund had ever imagined owning. This would be in addition to your title, of course, Magnus continued smoothly. Enough to ensure a comfortable life wherever you might choose to settle. My uncle believes in rewarding courage generously. Tormund stared at the silver, his mind racing. The offer was magnificent and obviously intended to be irresistible. With such wealth, he could indeed start fresh anywhere in the known world. Perhaps even establish himself as a merchant or shipowner, rather than a mere fisherman. But the very generosity of the offer made its true purpose clear. This wasn't a reward. It was a bribe, sweetened with just enough threat to make refusal seem foolish. That's remarkably thoughtful, Ingrid said, her voice carrying deadly sweetness. Though I'm curious why my father chose to send his gratitude through intermediaries rather than delivering it personally. Magnus's jaw tightened slightly. Your father is occupied with matters of state. The recent storm damaged several coastal holdings, requiring his immediate attention. Of course, Ingrid's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. And naturally, as his trusted nephew, you speak with his full authority in such matters. In matters concerning the family's welfare, yes, the conversation felt like watching two master swordsmen circle each other, each seeking an opening for a killing blow. Tormund found himself caught between them, acutely aware that whatever he said next would have consequences far beyond his simple understanding. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully, but I haven't asked for any reward beyond what your father already gave me last night. Magnus's expression darkened. Sometimes wisdom requires accepting what we haven't asked for, and sometimes, Ingrid added quietly, wisdom requires recognizing when gifts come with invisible chains attached, the tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Tormund could feel the morning's peace fracturing around them, replaced by currents of ambition and power that he barely understood but already feared. Think carefully, fisherman, Magnus said finally. Opportunities like this don't come twice, and the alternative paths can be unforgiving. With that, he gestured to his men, who closed the chest with a finality that sounded like a door slamming shut. As they prepared to depart, Magnus turned back with one last observation. My cousin has always been headstrong, given to romantic notions that ignore practical realities. I hope you're wiser than she is. After they left, Tormund and Ingrid stood in the morning sunlight, the weight of unspoken implications settling over them like fog from the fjord. He's afraid, Ingrid said finally. Of what? Of change. Of anything that might disrupt the careful world he spent his life arranging. She turned to look at him, her blue eyes serious. The question is, what are you afraid of? The revelation came 3 days later, delivered by an unexpected messenger. Tormund was mending nets on his dock when a small fishing boat approached from the direction of Ravnsholm. The craft flew no banners and carried only a single occupant, an elderly woman whose weathered face spoke of a lifetime spent near the sea. She beached her boat with practiced ease and approached Tormund with the deliberate gait of someone carrying important news. As she drew closer, he recognized her, Astrid the Wise, Jarl Hakon's oldest advisor, and the keeper of his household's deepest secrets. Tormund Eriksson, she greeted him formally. I bring word from your Jarl, my Jarl. The title felt strange on his tongue, though Hakon had indeed claimed him as a sworn man during the feast. Aye, and urgent word at that. Astrid glanced around the empty cove before continuing. Is the Lady Ingrid here? She returned to Ravensholm yesterday morning with her father's escort. No, Astrid said sharply. She did not. The words hit Tormund like cold water. What do you mean? I saw her leave with the warriors. You saw her leave with warriors, yes. But not her father's. Astrid's weathered face was grim. Magnus Ulfsson arrived at Ravensholm 2 hours after you last saw his cousin, claiming she had sent him to fetch a proper escort for her return journey. When Jarl Hakon questioned the delay, Magnus explained that the lady had insisted on visiting the village shrine to offer thanks for her rescue. Tormund's blood began to chill. Where is she? That's what we hoped you might tell us. Astrid stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Jarl Hakon grows suspicious of his nephew's explanations. When he sent men to verify Ingrid's presence at the shrine, they found it empty. Magnus claims she must have returned by another route, but searches of the entire island have revealed nothing. The implications crashed over Tormund like a rogue wave. If Ingrid was missing, and Magnus had been the last to see her safely, then the carefully orchestrated confrontation of 3 days ago took on a sinister new meaning. You think Magnus has taken her? I think Magnus has plans that require his cousin's absence, Astrid replied carefully. Whether temporary or permanent remains to be seen. Tormund's hands clenched into fists. The memory of Magnus's threats, the subtle menace behind his reasonable words, suddenly seemed far more dangerous. What does Jarl Hakon want me to do? He wants you to use that small, fast boat of yours to search places where larger ships cannot go. The coastline is riddled with hidden coves and forgotten anchorages. If Magnus has hidden her somewhere, it would likely be in such a place. And if I find her, Astrid's eyes glittered with something that might have been approval. Then you prove once again that courage and loyalty matter more than birth or station. As the old woman prepared to depart, she turned back with one final piece of information. There's something else you should know. Magnus has been receiving visitors from the southern jarls, men who have reason to oppose Hakon's policies of tolerance and reform. If something were to happen to both Hakon and Ingrid, Magnus would inherit with their backing. The full scope of the conspiracy began to take shape in Tormund's mind. This wasn't simply about removing an inconvenient romantic attachment. It was about seizing power and reversing everything Hakon had built. How long do we have? Magnus has called for a formal council meeting tomorrow evening, claiming urgent business regarding trade agreements with the southern territories. If Ingrid doesn't appear by then, he'll likely declare her lost at sea and begin proceedings to secure his inheritance. Astrid's weathered face was etched with worry. After that, even finding her alive might not be enough to stop what he set in motion. Within the hour, Tormund had provisioned the Sea Mother and set out on his desperate search. The fjord stretched before him like a vast puzzle, its countless inlets and hidden reaches offering 1,000 places where a small boat might be concealed. He began with the most remote possibilities, places known only to fishermen and smugglers who needed to avoid the attention of Jarl's patrols. Each empty cove felt like another nail in the coffin of his hope, but he pressed on, driven by a growing certainty that Ingrid's life hung in the balance. It was near sunset when he found the first clue, fresh rope marks on a concealed mooring post in Dead Man's Bay, a narrow inlet notorious for its treacherous currents. The marks were recent, cut by the passage of rope under strain, suggesting a boat had been tied here within the last few days. Following the shoreline deeper into the inlet, Tormund discovered footprints in the muddy beach, several sets leading inland toward what appeared to be an abandoned fisherman's hut. His heart hammered as he beached the Sea Mother and approached the structure on foot. The hut was larger than it appeared from the water, with thick stone walls that would muffle sound and a position that made it invisible from the main fjord. Smoke rose from its chimney, and through a gap in the shuttered windows, he caught the flicker of firelight. Moving closer with the stealth his father had taught him during boyhood hunting expeditions, Tormund peered through the window gap. What he saw made his blood boil with rage. Ingrid sat bound to a wooden chair in the center of the single room, her borrowed dress torn and dirty, her face pale but defiant. Two guards lounged near the fire, passing a bottle of ale between them and speaking in low voices about their orders to keep her alive and unharmed until Magnus sent word. 3 more days at most, one was saying. Then we take her north to the old fortress and finish this properly. The second guard laughed unpleasantly. Shame we can't have some sport with her first. Jarl's daughter or not, she's a fine-looking woman. Touch her and Magnus will feed you to his dogs, the first warned. She's worth more to him pure than ruined. Tormund had heard enough. His hand went to the fishing knife at his belt, sharp enough to gut a cod, but hardly adequate against armed warriors. He needed a plan, and he needed it quickly. The answer came from an unexpected source. His knowledge of the inlet's treacherous nature. Dead Man's Bay got its name from the way its currents could trap unwary boats during certain tides. If he could time his assault to coincide with the evening tide change, the noise of rushing water would cover his approach. As darkness fell and the tide began its inexorable shift, Tormund crept around to the hut's back wall. Through careful observation, he had noted that one of the guards periodically stepped outside to relieve himself, leaving his companion alone with Ingrid. When the moment came, Tormund struck with the precision of a man who had spent his life reading natural rhythms. As the first guard stumbled outside, Tormund's knife found his throat before he could cry out. Dragging the body aside, he waited for the second guard to investigate his companion's prolonged absence. The fight was brief and desperate. Tormund's smaller size and lighter weapon were disadvantages, but surprise and desperation proved stronger than armor and training. When it was over, both guards lay still, and Ingrid stared at her rescuer with something approaching wonder. "I was beginning to think no one would come," she said, as he cut her bonds. "Someone will always come for you," Tormund replied, helping her to her feet. "The question is whether we can get away before Magnus discovers his plan has failed." As they prepared to flee into the night, Ingrid caught his arm. "There's something you need to know. Magnus isn't just planning to claim inheritance through my disappearance. He's been meeting with southern jarls who want to overthrow my father entirely. If we don't warn him, this rescue might be meaningless." The stakes had just grown beyond anything Tormund had imagined. They were no longer simply saving one woman's life. They were racing to prevent a coup that could plunge the entire region into war. The night crossing back to Ravensholm was the longest of Tormund's life. The Sea Mother cut through black water under a moonless sky, her patched sails straining against the wind as he pushed her harder than he ever had before. Beside him in the stern, Ingrid sat wrapped in his spare cloak, her face pale but determined as she shared everything she had overheard during her captivity. "Magnus has been planning this for months," she said, her voice barely audible over the rush of water along the hull. "The southern jarls promised him their support in exchange for abandoning my father's policies. No more protection for the gay common folk, no more limits on tribute collection, no more interference in their slave trading." Tormund's jaw tightened. Hakon's reforms had made life bearable for people like himself, establishing fair laws and preventing the worst excesses of noble privilege. The thought of returning to the old ways, where powerful men could do anything they pleased to those beneath them, filled him with cold rage. How many warriors does Magnus have? At least 50 sworn to him personally, plus whatever forces the southern jarls have brought. The guards at the hut mentioned ships arriving throughout the day. Ingrid's hands clutched the cloak tighter. "My father's household guard numbers barely 30 men, and some of those may already be compromised." The mathematics of the situation were stark and terrifying. Even if they reached Ravensholm in time to warn Hakon, the Jarl would be outnumbered, 2 to 1 by enemies who had spent months preparing their assault. Worse, the attack would come from within his own fortress, launched by men he trusted. "There has to be something we can do," Tormund muttered, adjusting the sail as a gust threatened to heel the boat dangerously. "Perhaps there is." Ingrid leaned forward, her eyes bright with sudden inspiration. The beacon tower on Raven's Point. It's used to signal other holdings when enemies approach. If we could light it, every loyal holding within 20 miles would see the call for aid. Tormund considered the idea, his mind racing through the tactical implications. Raven's Point stood on a tall promontory on the far side of Ravensholm Island, its beacon visible across vast distances on a clear night. But reaching it would require passing dangerously close to the fortress itself, and they had no way of knowing who controlled what parts of the island. Even if we managed to light it, help would take hours to arrive. Magnus could finish his coup and present any reinforcements with a fait accompli, not if we time it correctly. Ingrid's voice carried the steel of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. The formal council meeting isn't scheduled until tomorrow evening. Magnus will want everything to appear legal and proper. He'll wait until then to make his accusations about my disappearance and move against my father, unless he discovers you've escaped. Which is why we need to move quickly and quietly. She pointed toward the dark bulk of Ravensholm, rising from the fjord ahead. There's a hidden cove on the island's north shore, used by smugglers generations ago. We can land there and approach the beacon tower from the inland side. As they drew closer to the island, Tormund's doubts multiplied. The whole plan felt impossibly risky. 2 people against an army of conspirators with nothing but surprise and determination on their side. Yet what alternative did they have? Every minute they delayed gave Magnus more time to consolidate his position. The hidden cove proved to be exactly as Ingrid described, a narrow cleft in the rocky coastline, invisible until you were almost upon it. Tormund guided the Sea Mother through the treacherous entrance, scraping past rocks that could have holed her hull with a careless touch. They beached the boat in darkness and began the climb inland, following what Ingrid claimed was an old shepherd's path. The terrain was rough and unfamiliar to Tormund, but Ingrid moved with the confidence of someone who had explored every corner of her childhood home. The path led them through stands of wind-twisted pine and across barren stretches of rock where they had to feel their way by touch alone. In the distance, the lights of Ravensholm's great hall glowed like fallen stars, deceptively peaceful in the darkness. "My father will be in his private chambers now," Ingrid whispered, as they paused to catch their breath. "He always reviews the day's business before sleep. If we could reach him, warn him about what's coming, with 50 armed men between us and him." Tormund shook his head. "We'd never make it past the outer gates, let alone through the fortress itself. Then we stick to the beacon plan." Despite her brave words, Ingrid's voice carried a note of desperation that tore at Tormund's heart. The thought of her father, facing betrayal and possible death while they crept through the darkness like thieves, was almost unbearable. They crested a low ridge and saw their destination ahead, Raven's Point thrust into the night sky like a stone finger, its beacon tower dark and apparently unguarded. But appearances could be deceiving, and Tormund found himself studying every shadow, every irregularity in the landscape that might conceal an enemy. "It looks empty," Ingrid observed. "That's what worries me. Magnus is too careful to leave something this important completely undefended." Tormund's fisherman's instincts, honed by years of reading weather and water, now served him in reading danger. Either he doesn't know about the beacon's importance, or he's set a trap. They approached the tower with painful slowness, using every scrap of cover the rocky terrain provided. The structure loomed larger as they drew near, a circular stone, tower perhaps 50 feet high, with a fire basket at its summit designed to hold a blaze visible for miles. At the tower's base, they found what Tormund had feared, fresh horse tracks in the dirt and the remains of a small campfire still warm to the touch. Someone had been here recently, though whether they were still lurking nearby was impossible to determine. "We need to get to the top," Ingrid whispered. "The beacon fuel is stored in the chamber below the fire basket, and there should be flint and steel in the keeper's box." The tower's interior was black as a grave, forcing them to feel their way up the narrow spiral staircase by touch alone. Each step seemed to echo in the confined space despite their efforts at silence, and Tormund found himself tensing at every small sound. They climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, finally emerging into the beacon chamber near the tower's summit. Moonlight filtering through the fire basket above revealed stacks of prepared wood and bundles of oil-soaked rags arranged for quick ignition. "There," Ingrid breathed, pointing to an iron box mounted on the chamber wall. "The keeper's supplies." Tormund opened the box and found flint, steel, and tinder, along with a small flask of lamp oil. Everything they needed to send their desperate signal across the dark water. But as he prepared to strike the first spark, a sound from below froze his blood, the scrape of boots on stone stairs. "Someone's coming," he whispered. They had perhaps a minute before whoever was climbing those stairs reached the beacon chamber. Tormund's mind raced through their options: fight, hide, or try to complete their mission before they were discovered. None of the choices seemed adequate against unknown numbers of armed enemies. "Light the beacon," Ingrid commanded, her voice steady despite their desperate situation. "Whatever happens to us, we have to warn the other holdings." Tormund struck flint to steel, sending sparks cascading onto the carefully prepared tinder. The dry material caught immediately, and he fed the growing flame with oil-soaked rags until he had a torch bright enough to reach the beacon fuel above. Footsteps echoed closer on the stairs, multiple men, moving with purpose rather than stealth. Whoever they were, they no longer cared about surprise. "Get that fire going." A voice called from below. "Magnus wants this tower operational before dawn." The words sent a chill through Tormund's heart. These weren't enemies trying to stop them. They were Magnus's men, coming to use the beacon for their own purposes, probably to signal the southern jarls that it was time to begin their assault. As his torch touched the beacon, fuel and the great fire blazed to life. Tormund realized with growing horror that instead of summoning help, they might have just announced to Magnus's allies that the coup should begin immediately. In trying to save Hakon, they might have doomed him instead. The beacon's light exploded across the night sky, visible for miles in every direction. Within moments, answering lights began to appear on distant headlands, not the signals of loyal reinforcements rushing to aid their jarl, but the coordinated response of conspirators who had been waiting for exactly this moment. They had walked directly into Magnus's trap, and in their desperation to help, they had triggered the very catastrophe they had hoped to prevent. The footsteps on the stairs belonged to 4 men in Magnus's colors, their weapons drawn as they burst into the beacon chamber. But instead of the enemies they expected to find, they discovered their own beacon already blazing, and 2 figures silhouetted against its light. "Who are you?" the lead warrior demanded, his sword reflecting the flames. "What are you doing here?" Tormund stepped forward, shielding Ingrid behind him. In the dancing firelight, with her golden hair hidden beneath his cloak's hood, there was a chance the men might not recognize her immediately. "Magnus sent us," he said, hoping his voice carried more confidence than he felt. "We were told to light the beacon at the first sign of dawn." The warrior's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "I know nothing of this. Magnus gave us orders to prepare the tower ourselves." "Plans change," Ingrid said, pitching her voice lower and rougher than her usual cultured tones. "Magnus wants the beacon lit now, not later. Every moment we delay gives Hakon more time to discover the plot." The mention of their leader's name and the coup seemed to reassure the warriors slightly, but their suspicion remained. "Show me your orders," the leader commanded. Before Tormund could think of a response, a new sound echoed from outside the tower, the deep, resonant note of a war horn blown from the direction of Ravensholm's great hall. The sound was immediately answered by similar horns from across the water. The signals Magnus's allies had been waiting for. "It's starting," one of the warriors breathed, and Tormund realized with sinking heart that the beacon's light had indeed triggered the assault they had hoped to prevent. The lead warrior turned back to them, his suspicion sharpening. "If Magnus sent you, why didn't he tell us?" His question was cut short as Ingrid threw back her hood, revealing her unmistakable features in the beacon's light. "Because Magnus didn't send us, you fool. We're here to stop him." The recognition that dawned on the warriors' faces was immediate and terrifying. Here was the woman whose disappearance was supposed to justify Magnus's claim to power, alive and defiant when she should have been safely hidden away or dead. The jarl's daughter, the leader whispered, then his voice rose to a shout. Seize her! Magnus will reward us beyond measure. The chamber erupted into chaos. Tormund grabbed a burning brand from the beacon and swung it at the nearest warrior, sending the man stumbling back with singed eyebrows. But the confined space worked against them. There was nowhere to retreat. And 4 armed men were too many for one fisherman with an improvised weapon. Ingrid proved she was more than a helpless noble, producing a long dagger from beneath her cloak and wielding it with deadly skill. The blade found its mark in one warrior's sword arm, sending his weapon clattering to the stone floor, but their small victory was short-lived. The lead warrior's sword point pressed against Tormund's throat, while his remaining companion held Ingrid's arms, pinned behind her back. Enough, the leader commanded. Magnus will want to deal with you himself. Through the tower's openings, the sounds of battle began to drift across the water. Shouts and clash of weapons echoed from Ravnsholm's courtyard, punctuated by the occasional scream. The coup had begun in earnest, and Jarl Hakon was fighting for his life, while his daughter stood captive in the very tower that had doomed him. You're too late, the wounded warrior snarled, clutching his bleeding arm. By dawn, Magnus will be Jarl, and your father will be feeding the ravens. My father has survived worse enemies than Magnus, Ingrid replied with fierce pride. Though Tormund could see the fear in her eyes. Not when they come from within his own house, the leader said with cruel satisfaction. Half his household guard have already declared for Magnus. The rest are outnumbered 3 to 1. As if summoned by his words, new sounds reached them from below. More footsteps on the stairs, accompanied by voices speaking in the familiar accents of Magnus's southern allies. The reinforcements were arriving, drawn by the beacon's light just as planned. Bind them, the leader ordered. Magnus will want to display them both when he announces his victory. But as the warriors moved to comply, Ingrid caught Tormund's eye and nodded toward the beacon itself. The massive fire blazed just above their heads, and the tower's stone walls would channel its heat upward like a chimney. If they could somehow, Tormund understood immediately. Without hesitation, he threw himself backward into the burning beacon, scattering flaming wood and oil-soaked rags across the chamber floor. The sudden explosion of fire and smoke sent the warriors scrambling for safety, creating the chaos Ingrid needed. She broke free from her captor's loosened grip and grabbed Tormund's hand, pulling him toward the chamber's narrow window. It was a desperate gamble. The drop to the rocks below was enough to kill them both, but the alternative was certain death or worse at Magnus's hands. Together, she said, and without another word, they leaped into the darkness beyond the tower walls, leaving the burning chaos behind them and plunging toward an uncertain fate on the jagged coastline below. The fall should have killed them both. Instead, they crashed through the branches of a gnarled pine that had somehow found purchase in the cliff face, its twisted limbs breaking their descent just enough to leave them battered and bleeding rather than dead on the rocks below. Tormund rolled to his feet first, spitting blood from a split lip and checking Ingrid for serious injuries. She was conscious but shaken, her borrowed dress torn and her hands scraped raw from clawing at the tree branches during their tumble. "Can you move?" he asked urgently. Above them, angry voices echoed from the beacon tower as Magnus's men discovered their escape. "I can move," she replied grimly, accepting his hand to pull herself upright. "The question is where. They'll have boats in the water within minutes, and every path off this island leads through areas Magnus controls." Tormund's mind raced as he considered their options. The hidden cove where they had beached the Sea Mother was too far away. They would be caught in the open long before reaching it. But there might be another way. The old sea caves beneath the fortress, he said. My father used to tell stories about them, smugglers' tunnels that connect to the harbor. If we could reach them, those caves have been sealed for generations, Ingrid protested. And even if we could get inside, where would they lead us? Into the heart of Ravnsholm itself, Tormund's voice carried growing excitement as the desperate plan took shape in his mind. "If Magnus has turned half the household guard, your father needs warning about which men he can trust. We're the only ones who know the full scope of the conspiracy." The sound of pursuit was growing closer, shouts and the clatter of armed men making their way down the treacherous cliff path. Whatever they decided, it had to be now. They stumbled along the rocky shoreline, following the base of the cliff toward the fortress that loomed above them. The ancient sea caves were exactly where Tormund's father had claimed, dark openings in the rock face, most of them blocked by rockfalls or deliberately sealed with fitted stones. But the third cave they tried showed signs of recent use. The stone seal had been partially dismantled, leaving a gap just wide enough for a determined person to squeeze through. More importantly, a faint current of air suggested the passage led somewhere other than a dead end. "Smugglers," Ingrid observed as they examined the opening. "Some traditions die hard, even on my father's island. They squeeze through the gap into absolute darkness, following the rough-hewn passage by touch alone." The air was thick and stale, but it carried the distant scent of wood smoke and cooking food, proof that the tunnel indeed led to the inhabited portions of the fortress. The passage seemed to stretch forever, climbing gradually through the island's rocky heart. Several times they encountered branches leading off into darkness, but they stuck to the main tunnel, following the strongest air current toward what they hoped was the fortress above. Behind them, echoing faintly through the stone, came the sound of their pursuers discovering the cave entrance. Magnus's men were following, but the narrow passage would force them to come single file, negating their numerical advantage. "There," Ingrid whispered, pointing to a faint glow ahead. "Light!" The tunnel ended at an iron grate set into worked stone, the underside of what appeared to be an ancient well or cistern. Through the metal bars, they could see torchlight and hear the distant sounds of combat. The battle for Ravnsholm was raging directly above their heads. Tormund examined the grate with desperate urgency. It was old but solid, held in place by rusted bolts that had been undisturbed for decades. But the metal had been weakened by time and moisture, and with the right leverage, he wedged his fishing knife into the gap between grate and stone, using it as a pry bar, while Ingrid added her weight to his efforts. One bolt snapped, then another, until finally the entire grate shifted enough for them to squeeze through. They emerged into chaos. The courtyard of Ravnsholm was a battlefield, lit by torches and the glow of burning buildings. Magnus's forces had indeed penetrated the fortress, but Jarl Hakon's loyal men were fighting with desperate courage, making the conspirators pay dearly for every yard of ground. In the center of the melee, Tormund spotted Jarl Hakon himself, his silver hair unmistakable even in the firelight. The Jarl fought like a man half his age, his sword weaving deadly patterns as he held the steps to his great hall against overwhelming odds. But he was surrounded and vastly outnumbered. Even as they watched, more of Magnus's allies poured through the fortress gates, their fresh strength tipping the balance decisively against the defenders. "We have to reach him," Ingrid said, her voice fierce with determination. "How?" "There are 50 men between us and your father." Ingrid's smile was sharp as a blade. "Then we'll have to even the odds." She pointed to the arsenal building across the courtyard, its doors standing open and its contents spilling onto the cobblestones. Weapons, armor, and most importantly, the great war horns used to rally troops and coordinate defense. If we can reach those horns and sound the call for the village militia, every fighting man within miles will know Ravnsholm is under attack. It was their only chance, a desperate race across a battlefield. To reach salvation that might already be too late to matter. The race across the courtyard was the longest 100 yards of Tormund's life. They ducked and weaved between struggling warriors, using the chaos of battle as cover while making their way toward the arsenal. Twice they were nearly cut down by Magnus's men, saved only by the confusion that made friend and foe difficult to distinguish in the flickering torchlight. They reached the arsenal just as Magnus himself appeared on the steps of the great hall, his voice carrying over the din of combat as he called for Jarl Hakon's surrender. The sight of him, clean and unbloodied while better men died around him, filled Tormund with rage. Ingrid grabbed the largest of the war horns, its bronze surface gleaming with ceremonial inlays that marked it as the horn of Ravnsholm itself. She raised it to her lips and blew with all the strength in her lungs, producing a deep, resonant call that cut through the noise of battle like a blade through flesh. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the fortress, men paused in their fighting as the ancient call echoed off the stone walls. It was the horn that had summoned defenders for 3 generations. The sound that meant Ravnsholm itself was in mortal danger. But more importantly, it was a sound that revealed the presence of someone who should have been dead or safely hidden away. Magnus's head snapped up at the familiar call, his eyes scanning the courtyard with growing alarm. "There!" he shouted, pointing directly at them. "The daughter lives! Take her!" Half a dozen warriors immediately broke off from the main battle and charged toward the arsenal, their weapons gleaming with deadly intent. But Ingrid continued to sound the horn, sending call after call across the dark water toward the villages and holdings that owed allegiance to her father. Tormund grabbed a sword from the scattered weapons and stepped into the path of the charging men. He was no warrior, just a fisherman with calloused hands and desperate courage, but he had learned something important during his years on the water. Sometimes survival wasn't about being stronger or faster than your enemies. Sometimes it was about being willing to risk everything when it mattered most. The first warrior's blade swept toward his head in a killing stroke, but Tormund ducked low and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, sending them both tumbling to the cobblestones. They rolled and struggled, each seeking advantage, until Tormund's fishing knife found the gap in his opponent's armor. The second warrior was more cautious, circling with professional skill while waiting for an opening. But before he could strike, a crossbow bolt sprouted from his chest, and he toppled backward without a sound. "Behind you!" Ingrid shouted, dropping the horn to grab the crossbow she had spotted among the scattered weapons. More of Magnus's men were coming, but now they faced a different problem. Across the water, answering horns had begun to sound as the villagers received Ravnsholm's call for aid. Torches appeared on distant shorelines as boats launched into the darkness, carrying every man capable of bearing arms to their jarl's defense. Magnus realized his careful timing was collapsing. He had counted on swift victory before help could arrive. But now he faced the prospect of a prolonged siege, with reinforcements coming from every direction. "Kill them all!" he screamed, abandoning any pretense of legal procedure. "Burn the hall. Leave no witnesses." But his words carried the bitter taste of desperation rather than confidence. The tide of battle was turning as Hakon's loyal men, inspired by the horn's call and the knowledge that help was coming, pressed their attack with renewed vigor. In the center of the courtyard, Jarl Hakon himself seemed to grow younger with each passing moment. His sword work became more fluid, more deadly, as if the sound of his daughter's voice had restored his full strength. Magnus's carefully planned assassination was becoming a fair fight, and Magnus had never been as skilled a warrior as he claimed. The end came quickly, once it began. As the first boatload of village militia stormed the harbor, crying ancient war cries and brandishing whatever weapons they could find, Magnus's southern allies realized they were trapped on an island with nowhere to retreat. Some threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Others tried to fight their way to their boats and were cut down in the attempt. Magnus himself faced his uncle in single combat on the steps of the great hall, his sword ringing against Hakon's blade as they settled their differences in the oldest way known to their people. It was no contest. Treachery and political cunning proved poor substitutes for a lifetime of honest battle, and Magnus fell with Hakon's sword through his heart. As dawn broke over the fjord, Tormund found himself standing beside Ingrid on the fortress walls, watching the last of the conspiracy's boats disappear toward the southern horizon. The courtyard below was being cleared of bodies and debris, while the wounded received care and the prisoners awaited judgment. "It's over," Ingrid said quietly. "This part of it." Tormund agreed. But what happens now? Magnus is dead, but the problems that made his conspiracy possible haven't disappeared. She turned to look at him, her blue eyes serious, but no longer haunted by immediate fear. Now we build something better. My father's reforms were just the beginning. If common courage can stand beside noble birth, if fishermen can save jarls and be honored for it, then perhaps the old rigid ways don't have to be the only ways. Jarl Hakon approached them, moving slowly but with dignity and tact. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, but his eyes held the satisfaction of a man who had faced betrayal and emerged victorious. "Tormund Eriksson," he said formally, "once again I find myself in your debt." "No debt exists between us, my lord," Tormund replied. "We're both just men who did what needed to be done." Hakon smiled at that, and Tormund saw where Ingrid had inherited her strength of character. Perhaps that's the finest epitaph any of us could hope for. As the sun climbed higher, painting the fjord in shades of gold and blue, Tormund realized that his simple life as a fisherman was truly ended. But what was beginning in its place? A partnership with people who valued courage over birth, merit over tradition, might be something even better. The storm that had brought Ingrid into his life had passed, but the changes it had wrought would ripple outward for generations to come.